All right, part two of this week's lecture series on David Hume. We're going to pick up just where we left off at the end of the first video with a critique of Locke's contribution to the history of British empiricism. We're looking at a difficulty with his theory of abstraction, right? So if Locke's representational realism is true, then we never have access to external reality, but only our ideas or representations of that reality, which, since we can't escape their grip, we never know whether they're actually accurate, or instead a source of error and confusion. And so Bishop Berkeley comes along and develops this attack on Locke's reliance on abstraction. So to go back to this model of representational realism, since your engagement with the tree is mediated by, and that is to say separated by, your representation or your idea of the tree, which may or may not correspond to the thing out there in the world, in this case in the park, you can't be sure that you're actually seeing the tree in front of you, and not maybe a trans-dimensional monster. Locke is, of course, not happy to rest at this point, and he wants to give us an effective account for how to adjudicate these difficulties and affirm with confidence that our representations, even if they're not always accurate, they can be made so. And this is where we get, again, what Descartes initiated in his Meditations, the distinction between the primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities of the tree, so the color of the leaves, the perceptible texture of the bark, the sound created as the wind whistles through the branches, the fragrance of the flowers, and so forth. These are potentially false because they're too entangled with your subjective sensibilities. So to get to the truth of this object you're calling a tree, as you engage it in your representation, you would abstract or eliminate away all of those secondary qualities until you're left with what? Its weight, its mass, its measurable movement, and so forth. And those are properties or qualities which can be determined in their truth in an intersubjective way. And so Berkeley uses this as his moment of attack, although Berkeley himself is an empiricist. So he's one of the major figures in the British empiricist tradition. He finds tremendous fault with this Lockean reliance on the intellectual process of abstraction. To give an example of his critique, he says, and this is an example of Berkeley's critique of Locke, but he uses Locke's own example here as a weapon. According to Locke, to get a real general idea, in other words, an abstract idea, a mathematical one of what triangularity is, of what a triangle is, you would have to conceive in your mind a polygon, so a triangle that is neither rectangle, nor oblique, nor epicural, nor scalanon, none of these specific kinds of triangles, but at the same time as all of them, right? Because the proper idea of, that is the true idea of a triangle, would have to accommodate all of these forms of triangularity, but privilege none of them. And Berkeley simply says, well, reader, I invite you to think through this and to come up with, or to see if you can come up with, a general idea of a triangle so described. He says it's impossible, at least it is for him. If you think you can do it, fine, do so and explain. But he says, at least for my part, I can't imagine a triangle that is rectangle and oblique and equilateral and scalanon and so forth. Now, further, in your mental image of this triangle, it would have to be defined by a line that is not any particular color, because of course, mathematically, triangles don't have to be determinately white or black or red or any other shade. So your mental image can't privilege any particular color. The thickness of the line would also have to be quite general or indeterminate, because the very mathematical concept of the triangle doesn't rely on any specificity in that regard. But again, any triangle you try to think of is going to be colored in such a way. And as a figure, it'll be colored against a differently colored background, right? You can't escape such particularity. Also, so Locke takes this, or excuse me, Berkeley takes this attack on the necessity of abstraction and runs with it in all sorts of applications. So he says, in ordinary experience, we think that it's the easiest thing in the world, if you're maybe at the grocery store or something, to imagine a closet with which you're familiar in some room in your house. So conceive of this closet. You're not at home now to see it, but presumably you have some idea what's on the shelf in that closet. So now Berkeley asks you, close your eyes and imagine this shelf in your bedroom closet, and come to a image or mental picture of a box that's on the shelf, a pair of shoes or whatever. So what have you done? You're conceiving of a scene in the world, and you're abstracting yourself as a subjective viewer out of the scene. Therefore, you can imagine, in this case, a mind-independent world. Berkeley says, great, except you're fooling yourself, because you haven't abstracted your subjectivity from the scene, because in thinking of this closet in your house, your mind is still framing it. You're not actively perceiving it with your eyes, but in your mental picture, you are the subject in which the very idea or representation is given place. So try to imagine anything by not imagining it. That is, by abstracting away a perceiver, a viewer, or a thinker. It's impossible, right? And so this gives us the Barclayian model, a version of idealism, in this case, subjective idealism, the ultimate dictum of which is to be perceived. So think about it. Anytime you encounter everything, whether through perceptual sensory experience, memory, or intellection, the one common denominator unifying all these potentially disparate experiences and their content is the beholder, the thinker, the perceiver. We might try to get at mind-independent reality as someone maybe sneaking around a corner trying to catch something before it's thematized. But in so doing, you're thematizing it in a specific way. You are capturing it as a subjective viewer through a particular or determinate orientation. Right? It's inescapable. So, in a particularly surprising or kind of ambitious application of Occam's razor, we should just get rid of the supposed existence of that second term in this model. So the substance, the object out there in the world, right? So to be is to be perceived, which is, in other words, to exist as an idea in some mind or consciousness. Now you might be thinking, so if this is true, every time I close my eyes or blink, reality as I know it disappears. And then it pops back into being the moment I open my eyes. Well, that would be true if Berkeley didn't supplement his view with an objective idealism, according to which, and you may have guessed this at this point, given that Berkeley was a bishop in the Catholic Church, according to objective idealism, whereas all of the content of our mental and experiential engagement with the world is an idea in our individual minds or consciousness, for our part, we are all ideas. The world itself and all of us who occupy it or frame it in our own thinking are ideas in the divine consciousness or mind. And God never blinks or takes a nap, thankfully, so the world never disappears and has to be resuscitated. And so it's very interesting that Berkeley reaches this quite obviously for many sane individuals, unsupportable, radical conclusion of reality, this metaphysical conclusion on the basis of a strong empiricist bent. And so that places Berkeley in a rather strange location vis-a-vis those four categories that we can connect, two in metaphysics and two in epistemology. Berkeley is an empiricist who's also an idealist. That's very unusual in the history of philosophy. But David Hume comes along, and I'm now noticing that I've run out of quite a bit of time in which to discuss Hume. But David Hume comes along and is even more radical in his insistent application of empiricist principles, on the basis of which he now says, okay, I follow your critique of Lockean abstraction and representationalism, Berkeley, but this deus ex machina, this way in which God is introduced at the end of the story in order to rescue us from an implausible, at best, or completely batshit crazy, at worst, idea of subjective idealism, is to ultimately undermine the fundamental principles informing empiricism in the first place. So Hume would ask, if, according to empiricism, all knowledge ultimately derives from one's sense experience, or from sense experience more broadly, at least in principle, and we have never had a sense impression of a being like God, then how can we possibly know that God exists, right? So as a thoroughgoing empiricist, much more than either Berkeley or Locke, in the empiricist tradition, the British empiricist tradition, we find Hume rejecting not simply idealism, because he's at odds with Berkeley, and also not simply representational realism or realism, because he's obviously at odds with Locke too, as we've seen, but he wants to simply stop talking about metaphysics and focus our philosophical energies on what we now refer to as epistemology, theory of knowledge. Let's take a look at that theory of knowledge. So this is Hume's fork, the so-called Hume's fork. It's not like a dinner fork, it's like a fork in the road. So two alternative and mutually exclusive paths. And so this is an epistemological theory. According to Hume's fork, all knowledge comes from the domain on this side, what he calls relations of ideas, or on the other side, matters of fact. And this builds on the basis of his empiricist approach that we've already spent some time with, namely that all knowledge first comes to us through the pathway of impressions, either external impressions, so perceptions, or interior or internal impressions, in other words, sentiments, emotions, or feelings. And so first we have these immediate impressions, and then we can form ideas based on those impressions and put them into all sorts of combinations and associations. And we're not really going to spend too much time talking about the three different associations of ideas. It's not terribly important. So all knowledge comes from relations of ideas or matters of fact. Relations of ideas are pieces of knowledge that can be known a priori, that is, independent of sense experience. And for that reason, such truths are, in every instance, absolutely indubitable. They are completely certain. So they are necessary truths, knowable a priori, and this also means they're analytic. And I'll explain that in the next lecture video, because it turns out I'm going to have to make 3 because 2 wasn't enough for this week. And so I'll end this now and start a new video.